we do not have an adequate definition anywhere of what it is to be a normal human being, other than to experience life as it comes down the pike, which all of us are doing.
Interesting. I like what you said.
Thank you.
So what we really, we don't really want to get into the labels of it, really, is I think what you're saying. We don't want to label this as it's this or it's that, because a lot of this is part of the human condition, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
And you're in an interesting field here, because, you know, as a cluster B personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, emanates from the DSM. Ultimately, I believe the first time it was spoken, it was in DSM-2. And you know, so you're speaking towards the essence of what is originally qualified. If you go back to the mythology, narcissism goes back long before the DSM. But when we're talking about narcissistic injury, I'm sure you're generally referring to, at least in no small part, to the definition that's implied in the cluster B personality disorder section.
Correct. Exactly. And I'm working with those who are exposed to these people now. And of course, I do realize that there's no cluster B disorder that exists alone. You know, that there's a little bit of flow between, you know, all the cluster B disorders, but there's some very specific traits and tactics used by people with NPD. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. But I don't want to focus the whole show on narcissism, because I just kind of wanted to touch upon that, because I think that's a question that we all ask. But would you consider NPD a mental illness?
Is the same. I have the same answer. If we can apply the same thing here, you know, the whole idea of personality disorder suggests the possibility of having a personality that's not disordered. And I don't know anybody who has a personality that's not. I've never met a soul that has a personality that's not disordered. And so, you know, we have, again, it takes a fair amount of hubris, a fair amount of audacity to try to suggest that people like that over there have an illness, because I don't have that illness, and I can already see that they cause a great deal of chaos or pain or discomfort in others. And because of that, I'm going to call them mentally ill. There's some degree of, you know, really maybe unworthy or undeserving freedom that comes into that capacity to make a diagnosis of another. So I certainly am not here to argue whether or not narcissistic personality disorder is a mental illness, but the whole idea of mental illness is on the table right now. The idea that mental illness is a variable conversation of an aspect of being a human, that the people who think they don't have mental illness feel comfortable pointing at those people and calling them mentally ill. And in many cases, people feel very comfortable taking on their diagnosis too, because it resolves in many ways. It helps to relinquish responsibility for behaviors and thought patterns in one's life that we're not proud of. So if you can say, that's not me, that's my ADD, that's not me, that's my anxiety disorder, that's not me, that's my narcissistic personality disorder. Sorry, I was born with narcissistic personality disorder, and that's why I act the way I do. Then that does simply serve to assist me in relinquishing responsibility for the parts of my life that I'm mishandling.
Okay. One comment that I often hear is, sorry,